Born into a journalistic family, his father, of course, was Ben Bradlee of the Washington Post Watergate fame. Now, Bradlee spent most of his working life on the East Coast, but he can claim ties to California journalism. After returning from the Peace Corps in Afghanistan back in 1972, Bradlee worked for about 3 years as a reporter for the Riverside Press Enterprise and lived in Seal Beach, he tells me. Most of his adult career is with the Boston Globe, though, where he spent 25 years as a reporter and an editor. In 2001 and 2002, as a deputy managing editor, Bradlee oversaw the Globe's coverage of sexual abuse scandals in the Catholic Church, which earned the newspaper a Pulitzer Prize. That hard-winning investigative journalism, of course, was immortalized in the film you just saw the trailer of, Spotlight, which won the 2016 Oscar for Best Picture of the Year. Now retired, Bradlee is the author of several books, including The Kid, The Immortal Life of Ted Williams, a biography of the famed Boston Red Sox player, which has been optioned for a Hollywood movie. Please join me in welcoming Ben Bradlee, Jr.
Thanks, Kevin. And, good evening, everybody. And thanks for inviting me. It's an honor to be part of your centennial celebration. And you have such a beautiful city. You really do. As Kevin mentioned, I started out in Riverside, which is not as fair as San Luis Obispo. But San Luis Obispo is so pretty. I'm thinking I might have been better to have started my career here at the Tribune. In my last year at the Boston Globe, I was privileged to have overseen an investigation by the Spotlight team into sexual misconduct by priests, which was, as Kevin noted, awarded the 2003 Pulitzer Prize for Public Service. Then, against all odds, our investigation was turned into a pretty good movie called Spotlight, which just happened to get the Academy Award last year for Best Picture. I mean, who knew? Sexual misconduct seems almost too tame a term to describe what hundreds of priests did in the Archdiocese of Boston, mostly to young altar boys, over the course of many, many years. These were rapes, actually, and they were the ultimate abuses of power committed by men holding positions of moral authority. These were scandalous betrayals, nothing less. This was not an unfamiliar subject for us at the Globe. We'd investigated wayward priests before, notably the case of a Father James Porter of Fall River, Mass. in 1992. We did a lot of good work on that story, but we hit a wall because we weren't able to get the internal church documents to bolster our case that we were able to get in 2002. And the church was very critical of us. The Archbishop of Boston, Cardinal Bernard Law, famously called down the wrath of God on the Globe. Can you believe that? In 2001, we got a new editor, Marty Barron, who would come from the Miami Herald. In his first week, Barron's interest was piqued by a Metro column written by Eileen McNamara, wondering if Cardinal Law had known about the misconduct of a local priest, Father John Gagan, who had been accused of abusing scores of young boys. Barron asked me to have the Spotlight team investigate. I was skeptical initially, worried about overkill given all the stories we'd written about the Porter case a decade earlier. But it wasn't long before the 4 reporters I was overseeing on the Spotlight team began developing compelling evidence of misconduct by scores of Boston priests over the years. Yet there were inherent problems prosecuting these cases. One was that the statute of limitations had passed in most of them, so charges couldn't be brought against many of the priests. And most of the cases had been settled by the church under terms which prevented the victims from speaking about what had happened to them. In addition, there was the problem of persuading victims to go on the record and talk about such a delicate and traumatic experience. But we were able to develop some key sources who leaked us internal church documents which showed that Cardinal Law was aware that bad priests were being passed around from parish to parish. And this proved that there was a massive cover-up going on at the highest levels of the archdiocese. The original story we set out to do was to try and determine how many bad priests there were in the diocese. It wasn't long before we developed solid evidence that more than 100 priests in the Boston area had engaged in sexual misconduct with minors. But in January of 2002, we put that story aside to do a piece on the man who would become the poster boy for pedophile priests, Father John Geoghegan, in advance of his trial on charges that he had abused scores of young boys over the decades. We turned this into a two-part series on the fly when we were able to get church records proving that the archdiocese had known of Geoghegan's abuses but did nothing to stop them. It was this narrower story, not the larger one about all the bad priests in the diocese, which ignited the scandal. The Geoghegan story took off like no story I'd ever been involved with before. You never really know what impact a story you're working on will have until it's published. Cardinal Law, who in the early 90s had steadfastly denied any misconduct by priests, this time apologized profusely for his own conduct just 2 days later in a press conference. He then began a serial apology tour around the state over the next year in an effort to save his job. The internet, which was then in its infancy, helped spread our story and extend its impact. In addition, newspapers around the country began investigating their own dioceses and finding the same abuses. The U.S. Conference of Cardinals called a meeting to discuss sexual abuse. The Pope summoned cardinals from around the world to Rome to deal with the crisis. Then, in December of 2002, Cardinal Law was forced to resign. Though, to the outrage of many, he escaped prosecution and was given a soft landing in Rome to head up one of the Vatican's churches. 5 years later, in 2008, two young and relatively inexperienced Hollywood producers, Nicole Rocklin and Bly Faust, showed up in Boston and came to the Globe to see us. They said they wanted to make a movie about how we broke the story. Frankly, we largely blew them off. We thought, who would ever want to make a movie about a sensitive subject like sexual abuse in the Catholic Church? And we were wary about it anyway. What if they made things up and misrepresented the story somehow? The two producers largely disappeared for the next 6 years and faced mostly rejection as they tried to interest Hollywood in this story. It was a tough sell, after all. The subject matter was grim, and there was a popular new pope. Steven Spielberg and DreamWorks came in for a while, but then they dropped out. Finally, Tom McCarthy, a noted indie director, signed up, as did Josh Singer as the lead screenwriter. They came to Boston and interviewed us for days. We gave them our notes, emails, and other contemporaneous primary source material from the time. They interviewed people we had interviewed. Basically, we discovered they investigated our investigation. This was an interesting process, and at times it was embarrassing for us. One of the people Josh Singer interviewed was Eric McLeish, a lawyer who had represented victims and made secret settlements with the church. He was depicted unfavorably in the film by the actor Billy Crudup. It turned out McLeish told Singer he had given the Globe the names of 20 bad priests way back in 1993. We had done a story about it at the time, but buried it inside the paper. Singer dug up the clip and asked Walter Robinson, who was the lead reporter on the Spotlight team, but he had been Metro editor at the time in 1993. He asked Robinson about it. Robbie had forgotten all about the story. It had fallen between the cracks. Anyone who works for a newspaper can relate. McLeish had sent over a fax with the names of the 20 priests without alerting anyone that he was going to do so. Papers get hundreds of faxes a day. It wasn't assigned to our strongest reporter. The story wasn't nearly as thorough as it should have been, but somehow it made the paper. When Singer showed Robinson this clipping, Robbie was mortified. He said to Singer, "You're not going to put that in the movie, are you?" "You're damn right I am," Singer replied. This turned out to be a good decision, actually, because it made the movie a warts and all portrayal. It was not just heroic, but showed the mistakes we made along the way. How sometimes you just stumble around in the dark, as Marty Baron put it in the movie. Soon it became obvious to us that the trust we'd placed in McCarthy and Singer had been validated. They showed us the script, and it was obvious they cared passionately about accuracy, about getting the story right. We each were asked to mark up the script with comments, and they took virtually all the changes we recommended. Finally, the film pulled together the necessary financing and was greenlit. An A-list ensemble cast signed on, including Michael Keaton, Mark Ruffalo, and Rachel McAdams. They began shooting around Boston, but most of it was filmed in a Toronto warehouse, where they recreated the Globe newsroom down to the T. When I walked onto that set, my knees actually buckled. I thought I was back at the paper. We all were so impressed by the actors and their diligence. They didn't just show up, read their lines, and get paid. They wanted to spend as much time as possible with each of us, asking how we got the story, what we would say and do in certain situations, and they asked about our personal lives. My doppelganger was John Slattery of Mad Men fame, and we've become friends. I kid him that he put a little too much swagger on me and made me more profane than I really am, but my guys say he got me right. One day I happened to be on the set when they filmed the 9/11 scene. Tom McCarthy, the director, came up to me and asked if I wanted to be in the movie as an extra. "Is the Pope Catholic?" I replied. Of course I did. Who wouldn't want to have a cameo in their own movie? So I played a reporter in the background taking notes. What else would I play? As Slattery stood next to me, issuing marching orders to put the church story aside temporarily and pitch in on 9/11. Of course, it had to be all hands on deck for that. They showed us a rough cut of the film in the summer of 2014. The screen was very small. There was no score yet, and the sound wasn't properly mixed. But it was an entirely different experience a few months later at the Toronto Film Festival, where we went to watch the movie's official premiere in one of Toronto's grand old theaters with 2,500 people in attendance. In addition to watching the movie properly for the first time on a big screen and in Dolby sound, we were of course curious to see how the audience would react, where they would laugh, where they would cry. It turned out there was a lot of both, actually, and when the movie ended and they showed those endless lists of cities around the country and throughout the world where sexual abuse cases had erupted after the story broke in Boston, people actually gasped. They had no idea the problem was so pervasive. Then they stood and applauded for several minutes. They kept applauding when Tom McCarthy called the 6 principal actors up on stage for a curtain call, as if it were Broadway. And then McCarthy did something special, at least for me and my Spotlight colleagues. He called the 6 of us who had been depicted in the movie up on stage and had us stand next to the actors who played us. Again, the audience stood and clapped. You don't have to. Now, the journalists here know that one of the first rules in reporting is you never use the first person pronoun in a story. In other words, you never write about yourself. So for us to actually be recognized in this way was entirely disorienting. But I'd be lying if I didn't tell you that was one of a hell of a moment which none of us will ever forget. So all in all, I think it's a good movie. And they managed to make investigative reporting, which is mostly boring, working the phones, and pouring through documents, not only cinematically interesting, but riveting. Yet there were none of Hollywood's staples. There's no sex, there's no car chases, there's no explosions. And the subject of sexual abuse was handled so tastefully and well, not through any prurient flashbacks, but by simply letting the victims tell their story. And it's important to remember that Spotlight is a movie, not a documentary, so some dramatic license was taken. Some scenes were invented to facilitate the narrative and the storyline. Some characters are composites, but overall the film is remarkably faithful to what really happened. Despite the success of our stories in the newspaper, we learned that film percolates into the culture in an entirely different way. In some ways, the movie has had a greater impact than the original stories did. We're seeing a whole new wave of victims come out has been especially rewarding. And appearing on panels with some of these victims has been quite an experience for me. And I've watched people come out for the first time in the guise of standing up to ask a question. These are great acts of courage. Of course, one of the main lessons of the film is to underscore the importance of investigative reporting in a democracy. Sadly, there isn't enough of it anymore. Mostly this is because newspapers are struggling to survive in the internet era. Newspaper staffs are down by 40% since 2003. So that means 2 out of every 5 reporters have disappeared, leaving crucial beats like state houses and city halls vacant, and many public meetings without coverage at all. More and more nonprofit news organizations, digital startups, university-based centers, and public radio stations are beginning to fill the gap, sometimes in partnerships. But it's still newspapers, even in their battered state, which remain the dominant media players in local markets. We're dealing with at least 2 generations of people now who have grown up without the newspaper reading habit and with the idea that news should be free. Most people these days seem not to care about reading a paper thoroughly or about being well informed. Rather, they're content to skim the headlines online without paying for what they read. But news can't be free, after all. What business can give away its product and expect to survive for long? Yet when most papers try to put up a paywall online, they're having great difficulty getting readers to pay for their product. I think this is outrageous. An online subscription is cheap. So please, do your bit for democracy by supporting your local paper. I actually looked it up, and a digital subscription to your San Luis Obispo Tribune costs $1.99 a month. I know this crowd can handle that. Meanwhile, at a time when newsrooms have been decimated by job cuts, too many editors have concluded that investigative reporting is a luxury they can do without. They're wrong. It's essential. Perhaps we need a new paradigm for newspapers. Maybe we can't cover every meeting and try to cover every bit of news. Maybe we have to aim higher and generate more original and exclusive investigative reporting. That may take more time, but it has more lasting impact. Reader surveys show people value investigative reporting more than anything else. So cutting back on such key work makes no sense. After all, the best stories don't come to you. You have to go find them. Like the movie All the President's Men did for my generation, Spotlight has rekindled an interest in journalism among young people. It's been a great morale boost for a troubled and distressed industry. But the question is, can it last? I'm hopeful that it can. I'm hopeful that people like Jeff Bezos, the head of Amazon and a master internet marketeer who recently bought the Washington Post, will figure out how to monetize daily journalism in the internet era. And the different platforms for doing good reporting will continue to proliferate. The fact remains that being a reporter is a fantastic job and a noble calling. I don't know of another job where you can have such fun and have a chance to change the world. Thank you.
tremendous message here tonight, from Ben Bradlee, and he has indicated that he is happy at this point to take some questions from the audience. So if you have questions, raise your hand. Mr. Curley there in the audience has a microphone. So
I think Ben Bradlee should have been at our panel yesterday at the Hayes Symposium to talk about some of these issues, because he's dead on. I, later in the program, was going to introduce this alum, 1961, Karen White, is a journalism graduate. So you've stolen my thunder, but ask Mr. Bradlee a question.
As we look forward, are we going to conclude that the presidential mess we're in now can be blamed on the media in its totality? Because I just keep watching as an old lady and an old journalist and thinking it's the media that is making this mess, not the candidates who are making this mess. Would you like to speak on that?
I sure would. I've been itching for that question all night long. You know, I don't work for the Globe anymore, so as Trump says, I feel unshackled. And I'm here to tell you that the stuff Donald Trump is saying about the media and the press in this campaign is outrageous. I've attended a few Trump rallies, and they put all the press in a pen, literally a pen, in the middle of the crowd. And there's a lot of hooting and hollering, and Trump plays, panders to the crowd and says, isn't the press dishonest and all of this. This is a guy who grew up in New York real estate, loving the press and having all kinds of relationships with the press. I'm personally sick of politicians blaming the media, big bad media, for their own discrepancies. I think it's high time we all fought back here. So I think, could the press do a better job? Is anyone perfect? No. But I think the press is doing a fine job covering this campaign, and it's Mr. Trump who is exposing himself rather than the other way around.
Next question. Hand up. Anybody else?
Hi, I'm Daniel Park. I graduated last year, and I'm still unemployed.
Hang in there.
Yeah. Speaking of Trump rallies, and as pretty much the only minority in this room, I was just wondering, what is the role you think that minorities and underprivileged groups can possibly make in terms of journalism in the future?
Well, I mean, we needed as many perspectives in newspapers as we can, obviously. And, it can't be, newspapers can't be all white. And I think having as much diversity in our newspapers, in our radio, in our television is essential. I mean, that's the short answer. Yeah. And I'm not sure I have any longer answer than that.
Craig Ream, stand up and ask a question, please. Craig Ream is a graduate of 78? Seven.
How has other media covered the abuse?
I'm sorry?
But how has other media, other newspapers covered the abuse as your newspaper did? I think of a colleague of mine, William Lipdell, who for the Los Angeles Times covered it in depth, came out with a column that went viral and came out with a book about losing his faith over the scandal. So I think that's one example, but how have other newspapers covered it?
You mean the church story?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I think the main dynamic that took over in this story after we did our first work was that other major metropolitan dailies began covering their own diocese and finding the same problems. this problem is deeply culturally embedded in the church. And I think there's been a lot of good coverage since. I think the Vatican could still step up and do more, as could the cardinals, especially, to take more of their share of the responsibilities rather than thrusting it on the priests themselves online.
Ben, to your left. To your left, Ben.
Hi, I'm Tara Mattina, class of 1990. We journalists are taught to be objective, so can you tell me about the conversations you had in the newsroom about balancing facts with compassion in this story?
On the church story? Yes. Yeah. Well, I worried initially. The coverage was so overwhelmingly negative initially, as it had to be inherently, I suppose. But I worried after the first wave, 3 or 4 months went by, you did think about all the good priests out there who were still doing good work. And so we stepped back and did stories on them rather than have the good priests be tarred by the same brush, if you will. I think that was an important step to take, and compassionate, to use your word. I do notice a larger trend in journalism these days in the context of the political campaign, to step away from your question about the church, that I think that we're seeing, papers, we all grow up rooted in, or taught to be objective on the one hand, on the other hand. But the things Donald Trump are saying are so outrageous that we're seeing a shift in the kind of reporting that is going on covering him. Instead of quoting an assertion he makes and getting an obligatory response from the Clinton campaign, more and more you're seeing this sort of phraseology in a story. Donald Trump incorrectly said. But I worry that we are such a polarized country that facts are not starting to matter anymore. People have their own facts, their own views of facts. Fact-checking is sometimes worthless, and one side is of the view that the press is so biased that if they report a lie, it's not to be believed anyway. So I really worry about that state of affairs.
Ben, one quick thank you.
I have a thank you, but I also have a question. Thank you for being here. I'm a faculty member of the journalism department and a long-time news reporter before I joined academia. When I was a reporter, there was much more investigative reporting going on. How do we fund it today?
And Ben, would you talk about the future of journalism and do it in a minute so we can all eat dinner?
Well, better minds than I are at work now on how to monetize journalism. They're doing all sorts of experiments. It's what I said in my remarks. Papers are putting up paywalls, but people aren't paying for the news. They need to. You need to pay your $1.99 to support the Tribune. Support local papers, especially. The New York Times and the Washington Post are still going to have enough resources to do investigative journalism. And I think the larger answer of how to fund it is way over my head in terms of, how many clicks do you get per month free and all of that. It's just, my eyes glaze over, frankly. I don't know the answer. But I think the short answer is support your local paper.